But while everyone was watching the spectacle, something far more consequential was happening quietly, without speeches or press conferences. The data began shifting, not slowly, not subtly, but decisively. American-made vehicles, once the backbone of Canada's auto market, started vanishing from dealer lots. No boycott, no dramatic announcement, just a steady, measurable exit that most people didn't notice until it was already underway. For decades, the US-Canada auto relationship was untouchable. Borders existed on paper, not in practice. Parts crossed back and forth. Vehicles were assembled across countries as if geography didn't matter. That assumption just broke. And what replaced it isn't about price, taste, or technology. It's about something far more dangerous for long-term power: reliability. And once reliability disappears, nothing else really matters. But to understand how this happened, you have to look past the politics and straight into the numbers, because that's where the real story starts. For most of modern history, American cars dominated Canada. In the 1990s, more than 70% of passenger vehicles imported into Canada were built in the United States. Even in the 2010s, that number hovered close to 50%. The system worked because integration worked. Factories didn't belong to countries, they belonged to supply chains. But by late 2025, that picture looked unrecognizable. During the first 10 months of the year, only 36% of passenger vehicles imported into Canada were manufactured in the United States. Not a dip, not a fluctuation, a collapse by historical standards. This wasn't driven by a recession. Consumer demand didn't evaporate. Canadian drivers didn't suddenly hate American brands. What changed was structural. Canada is still America's largest export market for vehicles. That part hasn't disappeared. But the direction of the flow has. The dominance that once felt permanent has quietly eroded, and the speed of that erosion caught even industry insiders off guard. What makes this moment different is that there's no natural rebound coming. This isn't a cycle, it's a redesign. And the trigger wasn't buried in economics, it was buried in policy. But that policy didn't just provoke a reaction, it triggered an exit. And that exit started the moment tariffs returned to the center of U.S. strategy. When tariffs came back, they weren't framed as temporary pressure. They were framed as leverage. In April, new tariffs were imposed on foreign-made vehicles entering the United States. Ottawa responded, but not with blunt retaliation. Instead, Canada applied counter-tariffs on U.S.-built cars, while selectively exempting automakers that still produced vehicles inside Ontario. The message wasn't emotional, it was surgical. The goal wasn't escalation, it was insulation. But markets don't respond to intentions, they respond to incentives. And manufacturers adjusted immediately. Imports were paused, sourcing was shifted, routes were rerouted. Those words matter, because they're operational, not political. Once a company redesigns logistics, it doesn't simply flip a switch back. New suppliers get contracts, new factories get priority, new dependencies form. This wasn't a protest. It was a contingency plan being activated in real time. Executives didn't wait to see how long tariffs would last. They acted as if uncertainty itself was permanent. And that's when something critical happened. The Canadian market didn't shrink, it diversified. And the U.S. wasn't at the center of it anymore. As American market share fell, others moved fast. Mexico surged ahead, becoming one of the biggest winners almost overnight. By October, the value of Mexican vehicle exports to Canada had already exceeded $8.4 billion, breaking previous full-year records. South Korea expanded its footprint. Japan increased shipments. Supply lines recalibrated with remarkable speed. But the most revealing shift wasn't foreign brands. It was American ones. Tesla, facing Canadian counter-tariffs on U.S.-built vehicles, didn't fight back publicly. It simply rerouted shipments, sending cars from its German plants instead. Subaru followed a similar path, increasing imports from Japan while reducing reliance on U.S. production. Neither company assembles vehicles in Canada, which meant their American factories suddenly became liabilities instead of assets. That's the key word: liabilities. For decades, U.S. manufacturing presence guaranteed access. Now it introduced exposure. And once that calculation flips, the logic of integration collapses with it. But the fallout didn't stop at imports. It hit Canada's own auto sector next, and that's where the story gets uncomfortable. This shift wasn't painless for Canada. Stellantis canceled plans to manufacture the Jeep Compass in Ontario, moving production to Illinois instead. Thousands of Canadian workers were left in prolonged limbo. Ottawa later issued a default notice, arguing that earlier taxpayer-linked commitments had been violated. Around the same time, General Motors announced it would end production of electric delivery vans at another Ontario facility. Then came Honda. An $11 billion investment meant to anchor a Canadian electric vehicle supply chain was postponed. Not canceled outright, but delayed into uncertainty. None of these companies blamed tariffs alone, but every decision unfolded in a climate shaped by tariff risk, political volatility, and open hostility toward the very framework that once stabilized North American manufacturing. Executives didn't need official statements. They listened to signals. And the loudest signal came next, from the very top. When asked about the future of the USMCA, the response wasn't reassuring. It was dismissive. Trump publicly called the agreement irrelevant, suggesting there was no real advantage and implying that whether it survived didn't really matter. Touring a Ford plant, he argued that Americans didn't need Canadian production at all. Those weren't policy details. They were warnings. The USMCA is up for mandatory review. If all parties agree, it can be extended for 16 years. If not, it enters annual review cycles, hanging in uncertainty until 2036. Any country can also withdraw with 6 months' notice. For industries that plan investments decades ahead, that kind of ambiguity is toxic. Tariffs were imposed, rolled back, rejustified, then partially exempted. The legal framework existed, but credibility didn't. And credibility is what keeps supply chains intact. Once it's questioned, every border crossing becomes a risk calculation. Which is why the auto sector felt this first. Because no industry is more exposed to friction than one that crosses borders multiple times before a single vehicle is finished. So companies redesigned around the risk. And that redesign revealed something much bigger. For years, trade loyalty was treated as automatic. If you were an ally, access was assumed. If you built factories, markets stayed open. But that logic no longer holds. What's replacing it is colder, more clinical, and far more powerful. Reliability has become the new currency of global trade. This shift has nothing to do with patriotism, brand loyalty, or even short-term profit. It's about whether companies can trust that rules won't change overnight. When tariffs are framed as bargaining chips instead of safeguards, every factory tied to that system becomes a potential risk. That's the part many people miss. Manufacturers don't fear high costs as much as they fear unpredictability. A tariff you can plan for is manageable. A tariff that appears, disappears, and reappears based on political pressure is poison. It forces executives to assume the worst and design supply chains that survive it. Even American automakers are sounding the alarm. Ford's CEO has openly warned that tariff concessions granted to Japanese imports, lowering rates to around 15%, give Toyota a cost advantage of roughly $5,000 to $10,000 per SUV. That's not a foreign company complaining. That's a U.S. manufacturer saying the system is tilting against domestic production. And here's the irony. Ford builds many of those vehicles inside the United States. So this isn't about foreign competition undercutting American labor. It's about policy chaos undercutting predictability. That's why U.S. automakers aren't asking for higher walls anymore. They're asking for stability. Because once uncertainty becomes permanent, loyalty disappears. Companies stop asking, "Who's our partner?" They start asking, "Where can we operate without surprises?" And once that mindset takes hold, integration turns into exposure. Factories become optional. Borders become liabilities. And the country that once sat at the center of everything starts getting quietly routed around. Not out of spite, out of self-preservation. And that realization is what sets up the most dangerous shift of all. For decades, American power didn't need to be enforced. It flowed naturally from one fact: the United States was indispensable. If you wanted efficient supply chains, scale, and stability, you had to build with America at the center. The auto industry was one of the clearest examples of that dominance. But what's happening now signals something far more unsettling. That indispensability is being engineered away. This isn't a loud rejection of the U.S. It's not a boycott or a diplomatic rupture. It's a silent redesign. Manufacturers are reorganizing supply chains so they can function even if American factories, ports, or policies suddenly become unreliable. And once that architecture is in place, dependence never fully returns. That's the reversal. Power once flowed from integration. The more others relied on American systems, the more influence Washington carried, often without saying a word. But when companies learn how to operate without that reliance, leverage flips. Influence fades not because it was challenged, but because it became unnecessary. What makes this moment dangerous for the U.S. isn't the loss of any single market. It's the precedent. If Canada, America's closest trading partner, can quietly rebalance its auto market away from U.S. exposure, others can too. And many already are. This isn't about inferior American products. Vehicles didn't suddenly get worse. Consumers didn't suddenly change tastes. The shift is rooted in political reliability, not manufacturing capability. Once executives internalize the idea that U.S. trade rules can change overnight, they don't wait for reassurance. They build redundancy. They route around risk. They design systems where American participation is helpful, but no longer essential. And when indispensability disappears, so does quiet power. What replaces it isn't confrontation, it's indifference. That's the most damaging outcome of all. This story was never really about cars, tariffs, or even trade balances. Those are just the visible symptoms. What's unfolding underneath is a much deeper shift, one that doesn't make headlines until it's already irreversible. For decades, American economic power rested on a simple foundation: trust. Partners believed the rules would hold. Agreements would be honored, integration would be rewarded, not punished. That trust allowed supply chains to stretch across borders, turning allies into stakeholders and markets into extensions of one another. But once trust becomes conditional, everything changes. When trade agreements are treated as temporary tools instead of long-term commitments, credibility erodes. And when credibility erodes, companies don't protest, they prepare. They quietly redesign their exposure, not because they want to leave, but because they can't afford to be trapped by uncertainty. That's what makes this moment so consequential. The United States didn't lose market share because its vehicles failed, or because its workers lost skill, or because its technology fell behind. It lost ground because reliability became questionable. And in global manufacturing, reliability is worth more than patriotism, price, or even scale. Canada's shift shows how this plays out in real time. There was no dramatic rupture, no angry declaration,